Now recording.
Hello everybody, welcome again to another edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. Around about 2 or 3 months ago, I did a talk, or an interview I suppose, a live interview at the Mind, Body and Spirit Festival in Kensington in London. And this was arranged by my publisher Watkins, and it was arranged in such a way that I would be interviewing a fellow Watkins author, which you guys will know about because I interviewed her recently, which is Dr. Penny Satori. And the idea was that Dr. Satori and I would actually spend around about an hour and a half discussing near-death experiences. And again, if anybody's interested in this, it is actually up on YouTube because it was fully recorded at the time. But when I was down on the Watkins bookshop stand, I spotted a book called The Gift of Alzheimer's, a new insight into the potential of Alzheimer's and its cure. And I spoke to one of the editors there, and I said, "This looks like an absolutely fascinating book." And the lady there said, "Yes, it is. They were really, really proud of this book, and it's really quite fascinating." So I got a copy of it, and I took it home, and I read it from cover to cover very, very quickly. And it was absolutely wonderful. And the reason I found it wonderful was that it really helped me because my mother is in the terminal stages of Alzheimer's disease. And as we know, it's a worldwide epidemic now. As we have an aging population, we have more and more people who are coming down with this sad illness. And more of our parents are actually having this illness as well. And the wonderful thing about this particular book is it makes you feel positive about something that is negative. It puts a really wonderful spiritual edge onto Alzheimer's and the tragedy of Alzheimer's. And it's written by a wonderful lady called Maggie La Tourelle. And I took the opportunity of meeting Maggie in London about a month ago, and we had a couple of cups of coffee in the sunshine on the south bank of London near London Bridge Station. And it was a meeting of minds because I really enjoyed my talk with Maggie, and I was so keen for her to be on the show with us tonight. And I'm absolutely delighted that Maggie is now joining us from London, which is around about 35 miles north of where I am now. So I'll tell you a little bit about Maggie. I'll be reading this, but effectively, and then I'll tell you a little bit what I think about Maggie anyway. But Maggie La Tourelle is a writer and therapist who's worked in the field of holistic health for over 30 years, integrating psychotherapy, NLP, kinesiology, and energetic healing. In her personal life, she has 10 years hands-on experience helping to care for both her parents at the end of their lives. Following the journey with her mother, who had Alzheimer's, Maggie wrote the book, The Gift of Alzheimer's. Another of Maggie's books, Principles of Kinesiology, continues to be a classic in the field after 20 years. Maggie lives in London, but remains close to her Scottish roots and loves designing and making things. That's the bare words, the actual words of somebody that is an absolutely fantastic human being and somebody that is absolutely fascinating. So without further ado, Maggie, welcome to the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour.
Hello, Tony.
Hiya. Right. Okay. What I would like to do is there's a series of questions I'd like to go through. We tend not to be terribly structured here, and we tend to it tends to be a general chat between friends. So effectively, it's your opportunity to tell us a little bit about the background. But really, I'd like to know, and I'm sure the listeners there or the watchers, I never know what quite to call the people out there because they can see us and listen at the same time. But effectively, if you could tell us a little bit about the background to the story of the book, and indeed what motivated you to write it.
Right. Well, as you've already said, my mother had Alzheimer's, and my parents were living in Scotland and I was living in London. And this was quite difficult because I was commuting between the two places, trying to visit there at least once a month. They lived on the west coast, which was a lovely place for me to visit. And it just so happened that where my parents' house was situated, there was a care home right next door. And when things got really difficult, too difficult for my mother to continue living at home, she went into the care home as a resident. But it did mean that it was very easy for me to visit her. So as far as the arrangement went, it didn't really have been much better than that. Other things about the family, I had a sister who had died a few years before, so that had caused quite a lot of distress in the family, particularly my mother. She was 85 when she developed Alzheimer's. My father was in his late 80s, so he wasn't really able to cope with what was happening. And it was after my mother she'd been in the care home for nearly a year when things started to happen that were of interest to me. I think basically she just became more and more frail. And the more frail she got, the more compassion I felt for her. And this all started when one day I was looking at, and my heart was really going out to her. And at the point that I was feeling that, she said to me, "You love me." And it was quite an astonishing moment. It just felt like a meeting that we hadn't had before, because we had quite a troubled relationship throughout our lives. Would you like me to show you a photograph of my mother now, so that you know what I'm talking about? So this is my mother, who was called Pat. She suffered from postnatal depression after I was born and never really recovered from that. She had, she called it one nervous breakdown after another, but, she might have been diagnosed as having bipolar disorder, I don't know, but it caused a lot of tension, so our relationship suffered from that. And immediately after she said, "I love you," or "you love me," in the care home, she followed it by saying, "I'm a bad person." And I thought, oh my goodness, what's she going to say next? And I wanted to reassure her, so I, did my best. I told her we can all look back and wish things had been different, but actually best we could at the time. And she accepted that. But I was curious. I'm a psychotherapist, and I was curious about what was happening, because she'd never spoken like that before. And I just started to jot down a few of the things that she was saying. And as time went on, the things she was saying became more and more profound. And she recognized this and said, "You must tell others." And I thought, right, I have a job here. So I started to record our conversations, both writing down what she said and also audio recording them. And being a therapist, it's my practice after I've had a session with a client to write up notes as a way of keeping a record of what was happening. And I just decided to do this. So after I'd been to visit her, I'd look at my notes and fill in or reflect on what was happening. And she was so frail, I thought that she was probably going to pass on, any time. In fact, she even said to me, "Is it all right if I go?" And not wanting to hold her back, I rather feebly said yes. So I thought that this recording of our conversations might go on for a few more weeks. Little did I know that actually it'd go on for another 3.5 years. So by the end of the 3.5 years, I had a lot of information. And I think what's unique about this is I don't know anybody else who has such a long record of conversations with somebody who has Alzheimer's, recording their words, not just the impressions, but the words of the person with it. And I think it's quite interesting also, apart from the, emotional journey that we were on, looking at this from another angle about the process of Alzheimer's and what happens.
One of the things that really intrigued me about the book was the way in which you write it, in that it's like a dialogue, and it's not like a dialogue. And you have this magical ability of really, I could visualize the circumstances, and I don't know whether I could visualize the circumstances because I relate so strongly to them with my own mother. But the idea of sitting there and calmly talking to somebody in the way that you needed to do was intriguing. But what was also, I think, the beauty of the book is the way in which you very sensitively described the background story. And I felt that I knew your mother as a person, because her generation and the difficulties she must have had, you know, with your father being an officer in the war and everything else, and coming back to an isolated, comparatively isolated part of Scotland, the particular structures of Scottish society and the formalities of Scottish society, which I think you got across extremely well. And also her strike for independence, because one of the things that I thought was fascinating was the way she was a dancer. She was incredibly artistic. And it must have been rather like my mother's world, where there were these unfulfilled potentials that generation had and never really fulfilled because of the way they were supposed to be. You know, they were supposed to be the housewife. They were supposed to be this. And I know from my own mother, her frustrations that she must have had over the years, you know. And the book, you wear your heart very much on your sleeve in the book as well, and that I think that's the powerful strength of it. But the things that really struck me, and as you and I have discussed, I mean, I'll be discussing your book in some detail in my own forthcoming book. I'm very intrigued by the strangeness of Alzheimer's and the way in which Alzheimer's seems to place the person in, as your mother put it, two worlds. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about this concept of the two worlds that your mother mentions many, many times. Firstly, if you can explain a little bit about how she described it, and then your interpretation of what you think was happening there.
Right. Well, this is what was really interesting to me. Quite near the beginning of this, of me recording our conversations, said to me, it's difficult living. And then she changed the word to working between two worlds. And I was really fascinated by this because I've been a seeker of consciousness from my early 20s and had some background to what I thought might be happening here. She said also near the beginning of our journey together, she said, we're learning we're immortal. And that was when she said, you must tell others. So that sort of confirmed for me that this other world was a world that some people would call a spiritual world. And she seemed to slip between these two worlds quite seamlessly. And I just got more and more interested in this. And my friends kept saying, poor you, having to go and visit your parents. And I was thinking, I'm so lucky, this is such an exciting and interesting journey that we're on together. And I wanted her voice to be heard. I wanted her to be able to describe what was happening to her. So although people say you shouldn't ask people with Alzheimer's questions, I actually asked her lots of questions, but in a very gentle. And what I think is happening is, as we know, Alzheimer's disease destroys brain cells, and it's a neurological disease that's progressive. And initially, people are forgetful and they become quite rebellious because they're desperately trying to maintain control. And that's the early stage of Alzheimer's that is the most difficult stage to manage. But there comes a point where I think people just cannot battle to maintain that control anymore. and they just have to surrender to the situation they're in. And I think that's when it becomes really interesting. And if you think about the film Still Alice, the film finished when Alice said something to the effect, I love you, or I love everyone. And to me, that was just the point at which I think the interesting journey begins. So I think there's a sequel to the film Still Alice. So when people go into this state of surrender, different things happen. More brain cells have died off. They lose their sense of self. Their ego becomes really diminished. They also, the left hemisphere that processes linear information, in Alzheimer's seems to me not to function as well as the right hemisphere. So her linear processing was affected, and this meant that her sense of linear time was affected. The result, past and future all kind of came together in the present. So here was my mother with her brain having slowed down, because the brain slows down in Alzheimer's, having lost her sense of self, her ego, and being in the present moment, in the now. If you say to somebody, if you're ego active and you're in the now, you're in a transcendental state. And this is the message of APCH Colley and many others. And I think this happens in Alzheimer's, but I think most people just haven't recognized that this has happened, because they get confused by the fact that the person can't remember the words they want to use, because they often can't articulate well what they're saying. That means there's nothing else going on. And that's the point at which I think most people, most family and carers, give up, and they just say, have another cup of tea. But for me, it was the other world, it was her journeys to the other world that I found really interesting. And because I had some background and knowledge of this, when she said things like, death is nothing to be afraid of, I was able to validate what she was saying. And actually, throughout everything she said, I validated it. And I think this is also really important, because whatever the person's experience is, it's real for them. And who are we to say what reality is? If people are reaching, as they are nearing the end of life, ego has diminished and they're entering some other realm or some other dimension, who are we to judge what reality is? I often felt that her reality was stronger than mine. And she would come back to this world, and she had all the usual limitations of, she was physically very disabled. I had to take her out of the wheelchair. Latterly, she couldn't move in bed. She had to have people to turn her. So she had all the physical limitations, and she acknowledged these and said, I don't like lying, having to lie flat out like this. But she managed to escape from these when she entered this other dimension that I'm calling, or she called, the other world.
A couple of things that you said there that I know we touched upon when we met has always intrigued me. This idea of the timeless state, the permanent now that people in altered states of consciousness seem to move into, and particularly individuals such as your mother and my mother and a friend of mine's mother who similar kind of things. I mean, a very, very peculiar thing happened with my mother when this concept of terminal lucidity and there's an idea that sometimes somebody is lost, but suddenly they become very, very aware of their circumstances. But it was almost the opposite with my mother, because what happened was that I get a phone call one day from the home, and they said that your mother is really upset, really traumatized. You need to speak to her. So I picked up the phone and I spoke to her, and she said, "Tony," and I said, "Yes," and she said, "These people have got me captured. I don't know how I've ended up here." She said, "I was sitting watching television with your father, and I've just had 40 winks, and I wake up and I'm here." And I said, "Mum, where do you think you are?" And she said, "I don't know, but these people have captured me and I'm going to sue them." And then she started turning around to the nurses and saying, "I'm going to sue you, you and you." And I said, "Mum, what's happening?" And she said, I'm being captured. And she said, "When your father finds out about this, he's going to be very, very annoyed." Now, I'd got no sense out of her for weeks before. And then she suddenly said, "You don't sound like my son." And I said, "Well, I am." And she said, "How old are you?" And I told her my age, and she said, No. You're not my son. My son is 20 years of age, and he's at university. You're a much older man. You're in cahoots with all these other people. I'm going to sue you as well." And it suddenly dawned on me that the circumstances, to me, from her point of view, seemed to be literally as if she was a woman in her, sort of early 50s, who had suddenly become aware that she was an old lady trapped in a home. And I said, "Look at your hands, Mum. Your hands are old." And she said, "No, I don't need to look at my hands. I know who I am." And there were one or two phrases in your book that reminded me of this. There was a phrase, wasn't there, where your mother mentions about the birth of you and your sister, or there was something, wasn't there, where she seemed to be in the past looking into the future. I mean, could you discuss a little bit about that, or other evidence you had that your mother was similarly in this kind of nether timelessness place, that her consciousness was going in and out and in and out?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're referring to when she said little blobs. It's difficult to take it out of context.
Yes.
My interpretation of that was, in the context in which she said it, was that these, we could have been embryos. But I don't know. But there were many other occasions when she frequently talked about deceased relatives visiting her. And she also described what I understood to be astral travel or out-of-body travel. And when she brought something up like that, I would then talk to her about it as if it was quite a normal thing. And I remember on one occasion having a little chat with her about astral travel. The next day, she said to me, my brother asked me to visit him, and I did. Her brother had been, deceased for a number of years. And it seemed to me that by talking to her about these things almost gave her permission to engage and to tell me what was going on. And your reference to this age distortion, I can remember on one occasion she said something about, I think I said, you look young, because sometimes she just looked quite radiant, even although she was, by this time she was in her 90s, I think, when this happened. And she said, "Oh, I feel young." And I said, what age do you feel? And I think she said 17 or 10 years older. Well, 10 years older was when she was pregnant with me. She also made reference to something about, I will have your hair. She asked me what color of eyes would I like? And this was a reference to when I was going to be in another body or in another life, I think. And talked about having my hair. She was going to have my hair. So there were on many occasions, and I always wanted to engage in these conversations, acknowledge them, and try and keep the conversation going. And I think it worked. I actually think that she probably had 3 opportunities to leave and decided that this was worthwhile staying on, because she talked about programs. Do you remember that?
I do indeed. Yeah.
She said, I need to wait for the next program. And I didn't know what program she was referring to. And then she said, I don't like the program. And I thought, oh dear, this may be something that she is expected to do in this life. But the 3rd time round, she said, I'm waiting for the next program and I can choose which program. And it seemed to me that she had gone through a process of learning. And, this was over a period of a year, and had reached a stage where she had real choice. And when she was talking about her programs, she referred to her television. And my interpretation of that was her 3rd eye. She said, I can go there and ask all my questions. Television is amazing. And it seemed to me that she was her 3rd eye was her portal to the other world. And I was impressed when she said, I can ask all my questions, because you have to know what questions to ask. And she seemed to know what to ask, because she was very excited about what was happening.
Well, many times in the book, she discusses, doesn't she, the way in which she felt her brain was being reprogrammed, or they were operating on her brain and they were playing with her brain, as if there were these kind of whoever they were sort of developing her and reprogramming her to a new form of existence that she would have some form of choice over. Now, one of the things that you mentioned earlier on was the way in which she seemed to be having kind of out-of-the-body experiences. And I really think it's profoundly important we don't miss the opportunity for you to describe the incident with the mini car and how strange that was, because that sent hairs up the back of my neck in its power and its vindication. That effectively this wasn't just a statement made out of the blue. It was something that actually related directly to something you had experienced yourself. So would you like to tell the listeners about this? Because this is astounding.
Mm-hmm. I will. I'm just going to backtrack for a minute to the operations. At the very beginning, she said, I've had an operation, they've taken something out. And I thought, this sounds like psychic surgery. I asked her where, and she said her brain. And she felt better after she'd had an operation. And as I say, this happened at the very beginning. So it seemed to me that I wouldn't say they were playing with her brain. It was like a conscious process that she was engaged in with energy. My interpretation was energy beings from, another frequency, another dimension, was it or whatever was working on changing the energy in her field, particularly her emotions and her mind. And as her Alzheimer's progressed, she became more and more psychic. And you're referring to one of many psychic experiences. When I had been in London, I was with a friend and I was explaining to him where we were going in Scotland. And just for fun, I went onto Google Maps and zoomed in on our house. And there, when I say my parents' house, there in the driveway was a mini car, which had been my mother's. Well, clearly the aerial photograph was out of date because the car had been sold years ago. But, I just commented to him, that's Mummy all. Anyway, the next day I was on the train going up to Scotland, and I went in to visit her. And I was with her when she suddenly said to me, "My Minnie." And I was amazed that she had picked. I wasn't actually thinking about that at the time, but she had picked up on my. It must have been in my field, and she had picked that up. And there were so many instances. Would you like me to tell you?
Please, yes, because this is the area that really fascinates me, and I'm sure will fascinate the listeners. Okay. Is the areas where she showed? I think there were about 5 or 6 experiences where she actually showed precognitive abilities, and they're all astounding. They're all absolutely astounding. So please share them with us if you're happy to.
I'm trying to remember. I mentioned about 8 in the book. There was one. If my teeth were all right, and when I went to the dentist, he found that I, did have a problem, and I wasn't aware of that. There was another occasion when the gas fire in my parents' house wasn't working properly, and somehow or other, I managed to fix it and get it working. And when I went to see her, she said, she called me Margaret. Margaret has fixed the fire. And it was interesting because she started talking about Margaret when I was there, as if Margaret was, someone else. I'll come on to that in a minute. I'm just trying to remember some of the other instances of her ESP. She anticipated, I think, the time of her death. She said on one occasion, "I didn't want to spoil your birthday." And I thought, what's she talking about? She didn't spoil my birthday. 18 months later, it was my birthday, and she was fine. And the day following, she had a sudden collapse and passed away. And it was as if she didn't want to die on my birthday, so that I had always had that association. At least that's my interpretation of that. I'm just trying to remember some of the other instances of her.
The one I remember was the one where you were up in Scotland because I think you were dealing with either your father's house or his estate or something about it. And she turns around out of the blue and says, "I want to be involved in the meetings." And you think, wow. Now, this is not, one could argue, playing devil's advocate, you could argue that they're just disassociated thoughts that are actually linking together, and we are picking up the disassociated thoughts and putting them into some form of pattern. The idea of the concept that's actually known as, sort of attention bias or confirmation bias, which the psychologists will have us believe why coincidences take place. But the reality of the situation, if you read Maggie's book, the guys out there, you will find that these incidents were quite precise. They weren't just general comments and things. I've just come across in my notes, I came across one of the notes that I made, where she says, "When I leave, where will I go? I'll be free. I need to get my energies in the right position. I am getting everything ready for a position for starting. I am getting the markers in place for the move. I've got everything in place, done everything." Now, these are quite precise statements. Now, was your mother ever into esoteric ideas or belief systems? Because I got the impression she was a very, very grounded, definite Scottish lady, part of the Kirk and everything else, which wouldn't have been the kind of thing she'd have been interested in, I wouldn't have thought, but I may be wrong.
I wouldn't have said she was very grounded because she was quite neurotic at times. And she also didn't have a lot of respect for the church. But she certainly had never been exposed to esoteric literature or information. So it wasn't coming from there. But I remember there's another one I just want to tell. The meetings, I'd forgotten that I was actually there to discuss my father becoming a permanent resident in the care home. I'd forgotten. I didn't actually know what she was referring to when she said the meetings. So it wasn't as if I was thinking at the time and she was picking up my thoughts. So the information was somewhere there. But there was another very difficult time for me when I was in London and I had a meeting planned in Scotland with our family lawyer to discuss finances and arrangements. And I had to make some decisions. I was finding it very difficult and feeling very awkward about being in this position. However, I got my bits of paper together, and when I arrived in Scotland, my mother was sitting at the other end of the lounge, and she called me over, and she said, Margaret's busy with funds and finance, and oh no, this is something I do not want her to know about. And later in the day, when I saw her a second time, she said, Margaret's a little confused. and she was right. So even though I was not wanting her to know about that, she was taking it up. And she had many psychic experiences. I've mentioned this psychiatry. She had what sounded like an out-of-body experience. She said, my head's not something connected to my body. There was a lovely moment when I missed seeing her on Mother's Day. And because I couldn't see her, I had sent her a card with red roses on it and a message about, how much I loved her. And when I visited her, a week or two later, I was looking around the room for the card and it wasn't there, but I didn't say anything. And she said to me, the lost roses, which was just such a beautiful expression. And it showed me that although the card physically wasn't there, she knew about it. So nothing was lost, really. And these instances, brought us closer together and more and more. And I think there's something about, being involved with the other world that it cannot but bring you closer to somebody, because to me, that's what really matters.
Well, it's intriguing, isn't it, as well, and the way in which, and I picked this up in the book, the way in which consistently your mother describes you as Margaret, as if you're not present, as if you are a representative or you're some kind of entity she's talking to about her life, and Margaret is her daughter, and you are somebody that is in her world that she's communicating with, as if, that her worldview is melding in some way, and she's dipping in and out of the reality that we're in now. I'm very saddened, by the way, and many of you may be aware of this, of the recent death of Oliver Sacks, the English stroke American, who spent most of his life and the end of his life in America, psychiatrist who wrote the book The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, and Awakenings, and Hallucinations, and various other wonderful books. But there is a section in one of his books, in A Man Who Mistook a Wife for a Hat, there's a particular chapter called Return to India, I think it was. And it's a young Indian lady in America who's dying. And as death approaches, she starts to spend more and more time back in India in her own childhood. And she seems to flip backwards and forwards between the Indian village where she was living when she was a child and her adulthood. And I sometimes wonder whether when people move into Alzheimer's, they're moving backwards in time. Now, there is a concept, and I think it's called neonatalism or something, the idea that we revert back as we get older, our bodies and our brains revert back to childhood, and we move back into childhood. And at the final stages of Alzheimer's, effectively, it's moving back almost into the womb as the neurological aspects and the connections within the brain break down just as they attach as we get younger, as we get older, I should say. And this leads me on, really, to a question that we discussed in great detail that sunny afternoon, is what is your interpretation? What do you think? You're one of the greatest witnesses to this, and I think your book will be recognised as being one of the influential books, particularly in this area of research, because it is subjective and because it's so powerfully written. So in your opinion, what do you think is taking place, and what can we learn from Alzheimer's? As you said, the gift of Alzheimer's. What are the insights and what can we learn from it?
I think, as I said earlier, Alzheimer's it's a process of dissolution. So everything is breaking down. In some respects, that is like going back to childhood. But actually, I think it is more allowing the more subtle realms, dimensions to penetrate and enter. It's hard when you've got a chattering mind to be aware of the more subtle realms. And I think that because in Alzheimer's, and I think this is where it's different from young children, because young children, their brain is developing and they're taking in a lot of new information about the physical world. And I think in Alzheimer's, the physical world is becoming less important because other dimensions are entering. And you asked me another question about what do we learn from this. I think learning that it's a process that doesn't end when the person finds it difficult to speak. A lot of people lose their faculty of speech. But my mother said something I found interesting. She said, no, my thoughts are clear. I'm confused when I can't remember. And she also made a reference to, she said, about something, I have no brain cells left, which was a self-observation of, her physical state. And it seems to me that in Alzheimer's, non-locality, it supports the hypothesis of non-locality of mind or extended mind. And what I've discovered with my mother certainly time and time again supported that. I know my thoughts are clear and confused when I can't remember. Suggests that her thoughts were still active right to the end. And it does make me wonder about what is happening with all these people who have Alzheimer's, who may not be able to express themselves in the way my mother was able to express herself. Are they in some kind of locked-in syndrome where their thoughts are continuing, but people aren't recognizing this and not engaging with them in a way that is meaningful for them? So I think that's something I would like, if it was possible to have some research in that area. I think it would be very interesting. And I have this with a neuroscientist, but they don't know how to start, looking at this. I think for people to really listen and not to be put off because somebody sounds as if they're speaking gobbledygook. When you really listen, if you start from the position that the person is trying to communicate something, what are they trying to communicate? I found that there were ways of deciphering what my mother was saying when she wasn't being clear. Sometimes people will substitute, if they can't remember a word, they'll substitute another word that has a similar meaning but in a different context. So I want to encourage people to try and keep the dialogue going and to listen out for metaphorical language, which can be really rich and beautiful. And I think because my mother and I because I was interpreting what she was saying or trying to and checking it out with her, and she was excited that I was actually able to, understand and validate her. I think that helped her to keep communicating, even although at the end she had very few words. The word was absolutely spot on. She did have terminal lucidity, and that came up time and time again. When I can remember one instance when in the care home, my mother wasn't well. She had a chest infection, and I thought this could turn into pneumonia any day. And my father wasn't well. He had a broken arm and had MRSA, and this lovely nurse said to me, "It's difficult for you having both parents, not well." And tears started to sort of stream down my face. And my mother said to me, "I don't bother to cry anymore." and immediately it just switched it like that. I could see my self-pity. And time again, she would say things that were just spot on, that summed up the big picture in a couple of words. Now, if her brain, if her thoughts weren't clear, she couldn't have done that.
Because it was interesting what you were saying earlier about locked-in syndrome, because as you know, I'm in the process of writing the next book, and I've yet to really write the section on Alzheimer's, but I'm coming to the end of the section on autism and Asperger's syndrome. And I've been writing about the experiences of a young Indian guy called Tito. And Tito has effectively the Asperger's cum autism version of locked-in syndrome. And again, the things he describes are very, very similar to the things you describe in terms of your mother's perceptions when your mother describes things. It's almost as if we probably need to start to be thinking of treating people with Alzheimer's in a similar way to the way we treat children with autism, in the sense that I argue that autism and Alzheimer's are all parts of the same, what I call the Huxleyan spectrum, whereby they're all elements of the same thing. They're all elements whereby the doors of perception, the Aldous Huxley doors of perception, are being opened as the brain's reducing engine starts to lose its grip upon how we perceive reality. In other words, the brain takes out information in order for us to be able to function effectively. In other words, we couldn't function effectively if our brain was taking in everything that was being thrown at it. So in other words, to survive, we have to, when we are living in a normal life, in a normal life situation, we have to deal with this ongoing informational field that we reduce down to what we need to do to survive. But in certain liminal states, be it Alzheimer's, as I say, be it autism, be it schizophrenia even sometimes, when I think the doors are blown off, to coin a very, very famous film phrase. The doors are blown off in schizophrenia. But effectively in these liminal states, we start to perceive the pleroma. We start to perceive what the Gnostics would term the reality behind the reality. And we start to perceive other entities that seem to be there, either guiding us or whatever. One of the two of the times when you mentioned your mother's experiences, I was reminded of the reports that individuals make when they were taking dimethyltryptamine, some of the research that was done by people like Rick Strassman. This is a fascinating area of understanding of exactly what our minds are all about, and we should listen very, very strongly to what these people have to tell us, and not just glibly turn around and say, "Oh, they're hallucinating. The word hallucination is a label that has been placed upon experiences that we cannot explain using our present scientific paradigm. This doesn't mean that they are not real. It just means it's our definition of what reality is. So therefore, your mother was experiencing these liminal states and perceiving things that she was trying to describe in the best way she could. And this is the thing moving on now, because what's your next steps? Where are you going with this? The book is obviously doing well, and hopefully will be doing a lot better now, because there's been recent developments I know that I want you to tell everybody about, that's what's happening in terms of things. So the first thing is what you're planning to do next. Tell us a little bit about what's happening in the month of September around the world, because it's important, because an awful lot of people are unaware of this. And finally, what's your next plans? What's Maggie La Tourelle going to be doing for your next book, and where you're going to take all these ideas?
Well, September is World Alzheimer's Month, and the 21st of September is World Alzheimer's Day. And I alerted my publisher to this. So we've been running a campaign with posts on Facebook every day where I've provided quotes from the book, things that my mother said that I wanted to remember. And I enjoyed doing that. And a lot of people, it's engaged people and reminded them of things too. And on the 21st, which is a week tomorrow, the Daily Telegraph, which is a mainstream UK newspaper, will be featuring an article that I've written about Alzheimer's, giving the positive aspect of Alzheimer's. And this is really amazing, because it's the first time that a mainstream paper or publication has dared to do this. And I'm very, very excited about it. There's a very big organisation in the UK called Saga, which is for people over 50, and they have a magazine and an online magazine. And I was commissioned to write an article on communicating with people with Alzheimer's, again for Alzheimer's World Alzheimer's Month, and that should be coming out around the 21st. With regards to my work, I still feel quite overwhelmed with all the spin-off from this book, but I have thoughts about writing something like the little book of Alzheimer's insights, which might condense, because the book's about 300 pages. It's quite a read, but I think that I might extract information from the book into a simplified form. I can see it already with a quote from my mother on one page and a little description about how one might interpret that on another page. And there's probably another book, the little esoteric book of Alzheimer's, where I might do a similar format, but with the esoteric material. So these are my thoughts, and but I also want to get back to. I worked as a potter for 12 odd years in the past, and I just want to make sure that I'm not spending all my time ahead and with words. I need to get back into doing things with my hands and making things. So I may go join a ceramics class.
Well, you're going potty. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Absolutely. Maggie, thank you so much for sharing what is in many ways an intensely private part of your life, both with us over the last hour, but also with your audience in terms of your books or your book. Because I think that it must have been a very difficult thing to write about, in the sense that it is personal. And I know that you've shared with me about some of the issues sometimes in terms of getting that across and the kind of privacy barrier. But effectively, it's brave people like you that are getting these ideas across to people who are not necessarily aware of Alzheimer's. It's one of these kind of hidden epidemics. It's hidden away. It's something that's embarrassing. It's something that nobody really wants to talk about. And that's why World Alzheimer's Month is so important. Because just because somebody is in a home, just because they're elderly, doesn't mean that they haven't got important things to say. And I think it's important we listen to what our elders tell us. Because effectively, you know, it's one of these things that I've looked through my life, and I've always thought that older people don't know what they're talking about because they're past it. But it's only when you start to get older you realise that our parents' generation, they went through the Second World War. They saw life in the raw. They saw life like we could not believe. They brought up families. They brought up children. They brought us up. The one thing that is important to always reflect upon is they have always been our age. There will never be a time in my life that my mother will have not experienced being my age, whereas we are yet to experience that. And I think that in many ways is the gift of Alzheimer's as well. So finally, Maggie, how can people get in touch with you, your website, your contact details, and any other bits and pieces you want to share with us in the final 2 minutes?
Right. Well, underpinning everything I've said today is none of what came about would have happened without a feeling of love and trust between my mother and me. So that's the first thing. As far as contacting me, I have a website that's dedicated to the book. It's the Gift of Alzheimer's.com. And there's lots of information on there. I think that I've covered most of the things that we were talking about.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Maggie, for that. Just to reiterate again, Maggie's book is published by Watkins Publishing. Maggie and myself both share the same publisher in terms of that. So it would be nice that maybe the publisher would be interested in actually pasting this on their wall as well, which would be really good if they were willing to do so. Right, thank you very much, everybody, for, again, listening in and watching the programme. Next month, we will be recording 2 shows in that we will have 2 guests back to back, which Dia Nunez and myself, who, lest we forget, there's Dia in the background there, beavering away, making all this happen. We never forget the fact that she is the lady behind all this, and her H2O network, which she interviews other people as well, and it's very worth checking out what she does as well. But next month, Dia and I will be talking to Dr. Janet Colley, who is a fascinating lady who's written 2 or 3 fascinating academic papers on the overlap between certain altered mental states, UFO abductions, and various other altered states of consciousness. Really, really fascinating. And she is very similar to myself in the sense that she's quite interested in what this is about consciousness. Is it the 0-point field? Exactly how do these altered states of consciousness come about? But also after that, I'll also be interviewing a guy called Stephen Breer. And Stephen is a very unusual individual in the sense that he is a high-functioning individual who has autism and savant syndrome. And effectively, this is going to be a fascinating discussion because Stephen is one of these people that has almost eidetic memory. He actually has a photographic memory. He is a very, very intriguing guy who has a fascinating website and everything else. So we'll be talking to him as well. So effectively, until next time, thank you very much. Thank you again, Maggie La Tourelle, for spending some time with us and giving us some wonderful examples of her mother, Pat La Tourelle, and also Dia Nunez, as always, for being the lady in the background. Okay, thanks, guys. See you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.